The jar of pickled okra fell. Irakai Vale didn't flinch when it hit the floor. He crouched down slowly, picked up the pieces, and kept moving, row by row, shelf by shelf, the same quiet rhythm he'd lived inside for 2 years. Midnight. Corner store. Fluorescent light buzzing overhead like it had something personal against silence. Nobody looked at him. That was the point. He'd built a life around that. No eye contact. No conversation beyond what the register required. People passed through this store the same way they passed through their own lives, fast, distracted, looking straight ahead. Irakai had learned that the best way to survive in a world that already wrote you off was to let it keep believing you were gone. Hi viewers, if someone you trusted completely turned their back on you when you needed them most, would you ever let yourself trust again? Drop your answer in the comments. The bell above the door rang at 11:47 p.m. 3 men walked in. Not the kind that browse. Not the kind that come for snacks or cigarettes or lottery tickets. The kind that fill a room the moment they enter it, like the air has to rearrange itself just to make space for them. Irakai heard the difference before he even turned around. The other 2 customers, a woman buying energy drinks and an older man at the magazine rack, both moved toward the door within 30 seconds. No one told them to leave. Nobody said a word. But instinct doesn't need instructions. Kedron Sorn stopped 6 feet from the counter. He was dressed simply for a man worth 9 figures. Black jacket. No tie. The kind of clothes that cost more than most people's rent but were designed to look like they didn't. His eyes moved across the store the way a chess player reads a board, not searching for something specific, just cataloging everything at once. His brothers stood slightly behind him. One tall, lean, watchful. Scanning corners and ceiling angles like he was already running exit routes in his head. The other was broader, slower to move, but quieter than either of them in a way that felt intentional. Not calm. Controlled. Irakai kept stacking jars. He felt the stare before Kedron said anything. It landed on him the way a spotlight does, not warm, not welcome. Just precise. Then Kedron spoke. Not in English. Not in any language the woman at the door or the man at the magazine rack would have recognized. The words came out low, clipped, each syllable carrying a kind of compressed weight, like language that was built for rooms where everything said could be used against you later. Karzathi. Underground negotiation dialect. Dead on paper. Very much alive in rooms that didn't appear on any official record. He said, "The shelf behind you. 3rd row. Tell me what's missing." It was a test. Obvious. Almost lazy in how simple it was. Everyone expected silence. Irakai set down the jar he was holding. Turned slowly. And answered, in the same dialect, with correct tonal structure and zero hesitation, "Nothing's missing. You're looking at the wrong shelf." The store didn't go quiet. It went completely still. Kedron's expression didn't break. But something shifted behind his eyes. Something recalibrated. His brother, the lean one, took one step forward. Stopped only when Kedron raised 2 fingers at his side. A signal. Don't move. The moment stretched. Irakai held eye contact just long enough to make it clear he wasn't afraid. Then he turned back to the shelf and picked up the next jar. His hands were steady. That took everything he had. Kedron didn't move toward the door. He moved toward the counter instead. Slow. Deliberate. He stopped directly across from Irakai, close enough that the alpha scent hit. Cedar and iron and something older underneath it. Dangerous in the way only very patient things are dangerous. He leaned one hand on the counter. Looked at Irakai for a long moment. Then turned to his brothers and said, just above a whisper, back in Karzathi, as if he already knew Irakai could hear every word. Why does a convenience store clerk speak a dead syndicate dialect? Irakai didn't look up. But his hands stopped moving. Just for a second. Just long enough. Kedron didn't leave. That was the first problem. He walked the store like he owned it, slowly, hands behind his back, picking up random items and setting them down without buying a single one. His brothers held near the door. Neither of them spoke. The lean one, Valeric, watched Irakai with the focused patience of a man who made his living reading people. The broader one, Torvith, said nothing at all, which somehow felt louder. Irakai kept working. Price check. Restock. Scan. Count. Every movement deliberate. Every breath measured. The same muscle memory that had kept him invisible for 2 years was the only thing keeping him functional right now. Kedron stopped near the drink coolers. Spoke again in Karzathi, low, conversational, like they were old colleagues catching up. You answered without thinking. That's interesting. Irakai didn't respond. Continued scanning a box of chips. Someone trained in the dialect hesitates. They translate in their head first. A pause. You didn't hesitate. Still nothing from Irakai. Kedron picked up a bottle of water. Turned it in his hand. That means it wasn't learned knowledge. It was practiced. Drilled. The kind of fluency that only comes from years of functional use. Irakai set down the scanner. Looked up slowly. Is there something I can help you find? He kept his voice flat. Helpful. Store clerk neutral. Kedron smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man who just confirmed a theory. You just did it again. Did what? Answered in Karzathi. Irakai felt the ground tilt slightly under him. He hadn't even realized. The language had just come out. 2 years of quiet and still his brain defaulted to it when the stimulus hit hard enough. That was the danger of something trained deep enough. It didn't ask permission. He reached for the scanner again. I don't know what you're talking about. Valeric spoke from the door. Also in Karzathi. But rougher, more clipped, the version of the dialect used in pressure situations. He's performing. His sentence construction is too clean for someone who just happened to pick up a few words. Kedron nodded once. His eyes didn't leave Irakai's face. There was a beat of silence. Then Irakai did something he hadn't planned to do. Kedron had used a conjugation, a small structural one, the kind most speakers outside the syndicate never bothered to get right. A tense marker for events that happened, in a space of agreed secrecy. He'd used it casually, which meant either he was deeply fluent or deeply sloppy. And Irakai's brain, against every instruction he'd been giving it for 2 years, corrected it. Quietly. Automatically. A single phrase under his breath, barely audible. The grammatically correct version. Valeric went still. Even Torvith, who had not moved, not spoken, not changed expression once since walking through that door, turned his head. Kedron's eyes dropped to the counter. Then came back up. And this time what was behind them wasn't curiosity anymore. It was recognition. That correction, he said slowly. That specific one. That's a diplomatic formalism. Used in formal treaty negotiations and back-channel syndicate arbitration sessions. He tilted his head. Where does a store clerk learn diplomatic Karzathi formalism? Irakai said nothing. The fluorescent light buzzed. A car passed outside. Kedron set the water bottle on the counter. Slid it forward. Like an offering or a mark. Then he pulled out his phone, didn't dial, didn't speak, just typed something with one thumb, efficient and unhurried. Then he looked up one last time. I'll take the water. Irakai rang it up. Made change. Their hands didn't touch during the exchange, but the distance between them felt deliberately maintained, like contact was a decision both of them were choosing not to make yet. Kedron took his change. Walked toward the door. Paused with his back to Irakai. Have a good night. He said it in perfect English. Irakai stood at the register and listened to the bell above the door ring once as all three of them walked out. He waited 30 seconds. Then sat down on the stool behind the counter and put his hands flat on his thighs. Steady. On the other side of that door, Kedron Sorn had already pulled up a message thread on his phone. His Security Intelligence Division. A man whose team could pull archived records from systems that officially no longer existed. The message was 4 words. Run the name, Irakai Vale. The response came back at 2:14 a.m. Kedron was still awake. He usually was at this hour, not because he couldn't sleep, but because the hours between midnight and dawn had always felt like the only part of the day that belonged entirely to him. No calls. No meetings. No performance required. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window in his hotel suite when the file came through. City lights 30 floors below. Everything quiet. He opened the attachment. The file was old. The formatting alone told him that the document structure was from a record system the syndicate had retired over a decade ago. Someone had digitized it at some point but hadn't cleaned it up. Header still in the old encryption format. File classification, internal. Access tier, senior leadership only. The photograph appeared first. Young. Maybe 22, 23. Dressed in the kind of neat, understated clothing that translators always wore in those days, professional enough to be taken seriously, neutral enough not to distract from the table. Standing behind a row of seated figures at what looked like an arbitration session. The name beneath the photo read, Irakai Vale, Strategic Linguistic Analyst, Syndicate Diplomatic Corps. Kedron stared at it for a moment. Then read the rest. The record was thin for someone at that level. A few pages of assignment logs, high-clearance sessions, cross-border negotiations, one multilateral arbitration that had taken 6 weeks and involved 4 separate criminal organizations who had agreed, for a brief and historically significant window, to sit in the same room. Irakai had translated all of it. Alone. No backup translator. No junior staff. Him, the table, and whatever was being said across it. Then the file changed. The tone shifted. The language turned bureaucratic in the way investigative files always did when the conclusion had been decided before the investigation began, flat, mechanical, carefully assembled to sound thorough without actually being thorough. A financial ledger had gone missing. Evidence had appeared connecting Irakai to its disappearance. Phone logs. Deposit records. 3 witness statements from colleagues who had worked adjacent sessions. The investigation had lasted 11 days. Kedron read that line twice. 11 days for a breach of that magnitude. An internal case involving a translator with top-tier clearance, handling the most sensitive negotiations the syndicate ran, and the whole thing was wrapped up in 11 days. The file ended abruptly. Final entry, dismissed, security breach. Status, closed. No sentencing record. No appeal process documentation. No forwarding information. Just closed, like a door pulled shut on someone standing in the middle of a room. Kidron set the phone down. Picked it up again. He went back to the witnesses. Pulled the names. Started cross-referencing. 2 of the 3 witnesses no longer existed in any active record, retired, moved, or simply gone from the organizational structure without explanation. The third. He stopped. Ran the name again to make sure. Came up with the same result. The third witness on record, one of only 3 people who had provided testimony that sealed Irakai Vale's case, was currently the syndicate's director of financial operations. One of the highest-ranking executives in the organization. A man Kidron had sat across from in board sessions. A man whose signature appeared on syndicate financial clearances weekly. The same man who, 11 years ago, had looked at an investigator and said he'd personally witnessed Irakai accessing records he shouldn't have. Kidron stood at the window for a long time after that. City lights. Quiet city. Everything below him moving in that slow, indifferent way that cities moved at this hour, no awareness of what was being figured out 30 stories above them. He went back to the file one more time. To the date. The date on the final investigation approval. The stamp that closed the case, formally and permanently, and made Irakai Vale's dismissal official. He found the authorizing signature. And felt something cold move through him. Because that signature, faded, scanned, 11 years old, was his. He came back 2 nights later. No brothers. No security detail visible, though Irakai was under no illusion that Kidron Sorn moved anywhere completely unwatched. Men like him didn't walk unprotected into late-night convenience stores in unfamiliar neighborhoods. The protection was just far enough back to be invisible. Kidron walked to the coffee station, poured a cup, and brought it to the counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Irakai rang it up. 247. Kidron slid $3 across the counter. Plain. No eye contact yet. Irakai made change. Slid it back. Their fingers didn't touch. Kidron picked up the coins slowly. Dropped them in the take-a-penny tray. Then looked up. He spoke in Karzathi. The arbitration record from the Devkara session. 11 years ago. You translated the 2nd and 3rd days of that session alone. Irakai's jaw tightened. He turned and began straightening the row of lighter displays behind the register. We have gum. 3 brands. First aisle on the left. I'm not looking for gum. Then I can't help you. Kidron wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Waited. The store was empty except for them. The street outside was quiet, the stretch between the last bar crowd and the first commuter wave, that specific hour when the city held its breath. The report on your case, Kidron said. I read it last night. Irakai didn't respond. But he stopped moving. 11 days from accusation to closure. For a breach involving your clearance level, that's not an investigation. That's a formality. Is there anything else I can help you with tonight? 3 witnesses. 2 of them unverifiable. One of them currently running our financial operations division. Irakai turned around. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't slow. He simply turned and looked at Kidron the way you looked at someone when you'd stopped pretending you weren't listening. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something much older than anger. Something that had been set down somewhere a long time ago and calcified, not forgotten, not forgiven, just filed away under things that had no more room to hurt. Kidron held his gaze. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Irakai moved to restock the cigarette shelf on the back wall. Kidron stayed at the counter. The distance between them was maybe 12 feet. It felt smaller. You already knew his name, Irakai said quietly. Not a question. I found it last night. And now you're here. And now I'm here. Irakai lined up the cartons with precise, deliberate care. Like the alignment of cigarette boxes was the most important thing happening in the room. What do you want from me? I want to understand what actually happened. Why? Because I signed the closure document. That landed. Irakai's hands stopped. He stood with his back to Kidron for a long beat. When he turned around, something had shifted in his face, not softened exactly, but reorganized. Like a man who had just been handed a piece of information and was deciding what to do with it in real time. He walked back to the counter. Reached under the register. Pulled out a styrofoam cup and poured himself coffee from the same pot Kidron had used. Stood across from him. Didn't drink. Just held it. They stood that way for a moment. Two people on opposite sides of a counter that suddenly felt less like a barrier and more like the only thing keeping this conversation from becoming something neither of them was ready for. Kidron reached for his change tray. Slid it back and forth between his fingers, not fidgeting, thinking. The coins slipped. Irakai reached for them at the same moment he did. Their hands brushed across the tray. Not long. Half a second, maybe less. But in the Omegaverse, touch between an alpha and an omega carried a weight that had nothing to do with intention. The nervous system didn't ask permission. It just registered. It just responded. Both of them pulled back at the same moment. Neither of them acknowledged it. But the air in the room was different after that. Not charged, not romantic, just altered. Like something had been introduced to the atmosphere and couldn't be taken back. Kidron looked at his coffee. Then, quiet and direct, I know someone framed you. Irakai went completely still. Not a flinch. Not a reaction. A full-body stillness that looked, from the outside, like calm, but was actually the physical response of someone who had spent years building a wall around a specific set of words and had just heard them said out loud for the first time. He didn't breathe for 3 full seconds. Then he set down the coffee. Looked at the counter. Good night, he said. Kidron didn't argue. He picked up his cup. Walked toward the door. Stopped with one hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. I'll be back. The bell rang. Irakai stood alone at the register. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside, the street stayed quiet. He stood there for a long time. Not moving. Because the wall he had spent 2 years building around those words had just developed its first crack, and the terrifying thing wasn't that it hurt. It was that it didn't. The lights in the negotiation room were always kept low. That was the first thing Irakai had noticed when he started, how deliberately dim they kept those sessions. Not for ambience. For pressure. People talked differently under low light. They leaned forward more. They lowered their voices. The shadows made every word feel heavier, every agreement feel more binding than it might have in a bright room. He had been 23 years old. The youngest strategic linguistic analyst the diplomatic corps had ever certified. Not because he was brilliant, though he was, but because Karzathi was a dying dialect and qualified translators were vanishingly rare. He had spent 4 years learning it under a retired syndicate archivist who had taken one look at his aptitude scores and decided the investment was worth it. By 23, Irakai spoke it the way other people spoke their first language. Automatically. Without thinking. Which was, in the end, exactly how they used him. The Dev-Kara arbitration had been the largest multi-party session the syndicate had mediated in a decade. 4 organizations. 6 days. A combined network of operations spanning 11 countries. Every conversation happening in Karzathi, because all 4 parties had agreed it was the one language none of them could be accused of holding an advantage in. Except Irakai. He heard everything. He understood everything. And on the 4th night, while the senior mediators were at dinner and Irakai was alone in the records room completing his transcription logs, he found something he was not supposed to find. A ledger. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Set precisely where someone who knew the room's layout would know to leave it, in the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet that only translators accessed, wedged beneath the blank session forms. It was a financial record. Internal. Not part of the arbitration proceedings. And the numbers inside it documented a pattern of systematic fund diversion from syndicate operational accounts, not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent. Monthly. Over 4 years. Irakai had closed the drawer and gone back to his transcription. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that for 2 weeks. Then he made the mistake that cost him everything. He told his direct supervisor. Not an accusation. Not a formal report. Just a quiet mention, the kind of cautious, professional flag that a young analyst believed would be handled appropriately by people with more authority and more context than he had. Within 72 hours, the investigation had already started. Against him. The phone logs appeared first, call records showing connections between his personal number and 2 external contacts the syndicate classified as security risks. He had never made those calls. He didn't know those numbers. But the records were clean, time-stamped, formatted exactly as legitimate logs would be. Then the deposit records. His account. 3 transfers, spaced over 6 weeks, each one small enough to avoid automatic flagging but large enough to matter when added together. Then the witnesses. 3 colleagues. People he had worked beside for months. People he had covered shifts for, shared meals with in the break room, helped with session preparation. All 3 said the same thing. That they had seen him accessing restricted financial files. That they had said nothing because they hadn't been sure. That now, looking back, they were sure. Irakai had sat in the inquiry room and told the truth. He had found the ledger. He had reported it. He had not taken anything, accessed anything he wasn't authorized for, made contact with anyone outside the organization. The inquiry lasted 11 days. The decision took 4 hours. No defense counsel. No right of appeal in internal syndicate proceedings. The system didn't require either, and nobody in the room seemed to find that troubling. He was escorted from the building with 1 box of personal items. His credentials were revoked. His name was removed from every session record he had contributed to, as if 4 years of work had never happened, as if the man who had sat in those dim rooms and carried the weight of other people's secrets in his head had simply never existed. He didn't speak to anyone for 3 weeks after that. Not silence as a statement. Not silence as protest. Just the silence of a person who had reached the end of all the words they had left. Back in the present. Back in the store. Irakai was behind the register when the realization moved through Kidron like a current. He had been sitting in the back office reviewing the file on his phone. Cross-referencing the closure document against the current financial director's personnel record, looking for the connection he already suspected but needed to confirm, when the authorization signature appeared again. His own name. His own signature stamp, applied 11 years ago to a file he had never personally reviewed, delegated through an administrative channel during a period when he was managing 6 simultaneous operations and had trusted the clearance process to flag anything that required his direct attention. He had trusted the process. He had signed what was put in front of him. And somewhere in that building, in that inquiry room, in those 11 rushed days, a 23-year-old analyst who had done the right thing had been handed the consequences of someone else's corruption. With Kidron Sorn's name on the document that made it permanent. He sat with that for a long moment. Through the office window he could see Irakai at the register, methodical, quiet, doing the small work of the night shift the way someone did when small work was all they'd allowed themselves to want for a very long time. Kidron set down the phone. Looked at the ceiling. Then stood up, walked back out to the store floor, and started thinking about what it meant to fix something that couldn't be unfixed, only corrected forward. Kidron put the folder on the counter. Not a greeting. Not a question. Just the folder. Irakai looked at it. Didn't touch it. It was a Thursday. Just past 11. The store was empty, it usually was this late, which Kidron had clearly figured out by now. 3 visits in. Same hour each time. The man was precise in everything he did, and the precision was starting to feel less like strategy and more like intention. Open it, Kidron said. Irakai kept his hands flat on the counter. Is this a request or an order? It's neither. A pause. It's an answer to a question you stopped asking a long time ago. That landed different than an argument would have. Irakai opened the folder. Inside were printed pages. Cross-referenced financial logs, internal syndicate records, 2 personnel files with sections highlighted in yellow. Not the original case file. Something deeper. Something newer. The kind of documentation that required active access to systems most people didn't know still existed. He read in silence. Kidron stood on the other side of the counter and didn't rush him. The fluorescent light buzzed. A car rolled through the intersection outside. Irakai turned a page. Then another. When he set it down, he didn't look up right away. You already knew all of this, he said. Most of it. Some of it came in the last 48 hours. And you're here because I signed the document that ended your career. And I want to understand why I did that. Irakai finally looked up. The expression on his face was careful. Measured. The face of someone who had spent years learning not to let what they felt become what people saw. You signed it because someone put it in front of you and you trusted the process. That's not an excuse. No, Irakai said. It isn't. That was it. No rage. No bitterness. Just a quiet, accurate accounting that somehow hit harder than either of those things would have. Kidron looked at the folder. Why didn't you come back and fight it? Irakai was quiet for a moment. Long enough that the silence had its own weight. Then, because nobody powerful wanted the truth. 6 words. 6 words, and Kidron felt them move through him like something cold and clarifying, because he knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had lived inside that system for decades, that they were completely accurate. Nobody had wanted the truth. Not because they were cruel. Because the truth was inconvenient. Because the truth required looking closely at something that powerful people had already decided to look away from. Because in systems built on hierarchy and speed and the quiet assumption that the right people always end up in the right positions, the ones who get sacrificed are almost never the ones who deserve it. They are the ones who are easiest to move. I'm going to reopen the case, Kedron said. Internally? Yes. Then it won't be public. No. Irakai closed the folder. Pushed it back across the counter with 2 fingers. Slow. Deliberate. I've heard that before. Promises from powerful people have a specific shelf life. It's shorter than they think. I know. Then you understand why I'm not celebrating. I do. Another silence. Different from the ones before. Not tense. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens between 2 people who have said something real and are letting it settle. Kedron picked up the folder. I'll need access to the original session archives. The DevCara transcription logs specifically. I don't have them. I know. I do. He turned toward the door. 3 steps. Then stopped. The financial director. He said the title without a name. His personnel file goes back 14 years. The diversion pattern started 13 years ago. Irakai stood very still. He was doing it before the arbitration. Yes. Which means framing me wasn't about the ledger I found. Kedron turned around. No. The ledger was already incriminating on its own. Framing you was about making sure the person who found it couldn't be believed. The store was completely quiet. Irakai stood at the register. Didn't speak. Because there are things that take a moment to fully land, not because they're complicated, but because the mind protects itself from absorbing the full weight of certain truths all at once. It lets them in a little at a time. This one was taking its time. Kedron watched him for a moment. Then walked out. The bell above the door rang. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a corner office on the 37th floor of the syndicate's administrative tower, a man named Devonte Price, Director of Financial Operations, 11-year untouched secret, was about to receive a calendar notification. An internal review meeting. Flagged by senior leadership. Marked urgent. The first thing Kedron pulled was the audit trail. Not the investigation file from 11 years ago. That was already compromised. Shaped, trimmed, directed toward a conclusion that had been decided in advance. No. He went deeper than that. He pulled the raw financial transaction records. The ones that lived in the syndicate's base accounting system, not the summary documents that leadership reviewed, but the actual line-item entries. The kind of records that systems generated automatically and that nobody thought to falsify because falsifying them would require knowing exactly where to look. Devonte Price had been careful. That was the first thing Kedron noticed. Not sloppy. Not greedy. Patient. The kind of careful that comes from someone who understood systems well enough to know where the gaps were, and had spent years moving through those gaps in amounts small enough to stay invisible. 400 here. 2,000 there. Routed through subsidiary accounts, reclassified as operational expenses, absorbed into budget line items that moved quickly and were rarely scrutinized twice. Over 13 years, the total came to just under $4 million. Vailric had done the projection modeling. Sitting at the glass table in Kedron's suite at 2 in the morning, 3 laptops open, a half-eaten room service order pushed to the side, he'd laid out the full picture without editorializing. Because Vailric didn't editorialize. He presented. He would have hit 5 million within 18 months if left uninterrupted. But Irakai found the ledger and reported it, which put Price in a position where he either had to let the investigation proceed, which meant his own records eventually surfacing, or redirect it. He redirected it cleanly. The witnesses were his. 2 of them were on his informal payroll, not salary, just favors. The kind that accumulate over years. Torvith, who had been sitting near the window saying nothing for the better part of an hour, spoke then. His voice was low, unhurried. The 3rd witness, the one still in the organization, retired 2 years after the case closed. Price facilitated the retirement package. Torvith nodded once. Filed it. Kedron stood at the window, the same city below, the same hour of the night that had been his thinking hour for as long as he could remember. If we move against Price directly, the board finds out. That becomes a public liability question. The syndicate's financial credibility takes a hit during a period when 3 of our major shipping contracts are under renegotiation. Correct, Vailric said. If we don't move, the embezzlement continues. And a man who framed someone for it stays in a position of authority over the same financial systems he's been stealing from. Vailric closed one of the laptops. Looked at his brother. The math on that one is straightforward. The math isn't the problem. The optics are. The optics, Kedron said, are exactly the problem. He turned away from the window. Because there was a version of this, a clean, efficient, internally contained version, where Devonte Price was quietly removed. No scandal. No press. No market disruption. Just a leadership transition handled through the standard mechanisms the syndicate had always used for its less public corrections. And in that version, Irakai Vale got a cleared record. And probably an offer. And the story of what had actually happened to him stayed inside the walls of the organization that had done it to him. Which was not justice. It was management. Kedron kept visiting the store. Not every night. 3 or 4 times a week. He told himself it was because the case required proximity, that he needed to understand Irakai's account of events from the inside out, not from a file. That proximity was a professional tool. He told himself that. What actually happened was conversation. Slow. Careful. The kind that happened in the gaps between the work, while Irakai was restocking, while Kedron stood at the counter with his coffee growing cold. Questions that started operational and shifted, almost without either of them noticing, into something else. What Irakai had studied before the syndicate. What languages came before Karzathi. What he'd wanted to do with his career before it had been taken from him. Irakai answered in short sentences. He still kept the counter between them. He still held back more than he gave. But he answered. One night, near closing, Irakai asked a question. Quiet. Without looking up from the register tape he was running. If you expose him, your empire could fracture. Shipping contracts. Financial credibility. 3 months before a major renegotiation cycle. He finally looked up. Will you still do it? Kedron held the coffee cup in both hands. Looked at Irakai for a long moment. And didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer, the one that had been forming slowly over 3 sleepless nights and a conversation he couldn't stop replaying, was more complicated than yes or no. And Irakai deserved the complicated version. Not the clean one. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. No press. No announcement. No external record beyond an internal calendar entry that would be archived and forgotten within the administrative cycle. Devonte Price walked into the 43rd floor conference room at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. He walked out 47 minutes later without his access credentials, without a severance negotiation on the table, and with a legal hold document in a manila folder under his arm. The kind that outlined, in precise and unambiguous language, what cooperation with the Internal Financial Review would require of him and what non-cooperation would cost. He didn't argue. That was the thing about men who had spent years moving carefully through systems. When the system finally turned around and looked directly at them, they already knew the math. Kedron had not been in the room. He had sent Vailric, which was its own kind of statement. Vailric, who spoke in shorter sentences than anyone Irakai had ever heard Kedron describe. Vailric, who had a way of presenting facts that made arguing with them feel structurally unsound. The three witnesses from the original case were contacted separately. Two were retirees now, living quiet, comfortable lives funded in part by a financial director who had known exactly what he was buying with those retirement packages. The third had passed away 4 years prior. The two living witnesses provided revised statements within 72 hours. Not willingly. Not warmly. But they provided them. Kedron reviewed the final documentation in his suite. All of it. Every page. This time he read slowly, not delegating, not skimming, not trusting the process to catch what he should have caught the first time. His own signature was going on this correction the same way it had gone on the original error. That mattered to him. The markets reacted to Price's departure announcement with moderate indifference, which was the best possible outcome. The official language cited a planned retirement transition. The financial review findings were sealed under internal protocols. 3 of the major shipping contracts moved into their renegotiation phase on schedule. The fracture Irakai had predicted didn't happen. Not because it couldn't have. Because Kedron had spent 10 days preparing the organization to absorb the correction before making it. Because Vailric had built a transition structure that left no gap in leadership visible from the outside. Because Torvith had spent a week on the phone with the 3 most nervous board members, one at a time, not reassuring them, informing them. There was a difference. On a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the meeting, Kedron drove to the store alone. No coffee this time. He walked to the counter. Reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Set a folder on the laminate surface between them. Irakai looked at it. Then at him. Another one. Last one, Kedron said. Irakai opened it. The document inside was 2 pages. Official syndicate letterhead. Formatted in the dry, formal language of institutional correction, the kind of language that tried very hard to sound routine while doing something that was, in fact, the opposite of routine. It was a full restoration of record. His name. His clearance level. His years of service. His analytical designation. All of it, returned. The dismissal classification removed. The case closed under a new designation, finding vacated. Evidence fabricated. Below that, a second document. A letter. Less formal. Written in language that felt like it had actually been chosen by a person rather than generated by a committee. Acknowledging, specifically, that the original investigation had been compromised. That the evidence against him had been constructed. That the syndicate had failed in its obligation to verify before acting. That his dismissal had been unjust. Irakai read both pages. Read them again. He set them down on the counter carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure what to do with your hands. Kidron waited. The store was quiet. The light buzzed. Somewhere outside a truck rumbled past and faded. Irakai pressed 2 fingers against the top edge of the letter. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He didn't say thank you or finally or any of the things that the narrative logic of the moment seemed to be waiting for. What he did was stand there, completely still. With the expression of a man who had received something he had stopped expecting and was now carefully, quietly deciding what it meant. Kidron watched him and said nothing. Because this was not his moment to fill. After a long while, Irakai looked up. His voice was steady. Low. Justice came, he said. A pause. It took 11 years. And most of my 30s. And every version of the career I thought I was building. He looked at the letter. But it came. Kidron nodded. Irakai closed the folder. And for the first time in 2 years behind that counter, for the first time in longer than that, let out a breath that came from somewhere deep. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. The specific exhale of a person who has been carrying something for so long they forgot it had weight. 3 days passed before Kidron asked the question. He had been thinking about the timing. Not overthinking it, just being honest with himself about what the right moment looked like. Too soon felt transactional. Too late felt like he was waiting for Irakai to bring it up first, which wasn't fair. The man had spent 11 years being acted upon by other people's decisions. He didn't need to carry the weight of this one too. It was a Saturday. The store was slow. Irakai was behind the counter running inventory counts on a tablet, the kind of quiet manual work that looked like nothing from the outside but actually required focus. Kidron ordered coffee. Stood at the counter. Waited until Irakai set the tablet down. Then said it plainly. The syndicate wants to offer you a position. Diplomatic advisory. Senior level. Your own portfolio, your own cases. Full clearance restored. Salary commensurate with what your career trajectory would have been if the case had never happened. Irakai looked at him. Not surprised. Not grateful. Just looking, the way he looked at everything, like he was taking it apart to understand what it actually was before deciding how to respond to it. The syndicate, he said. Or you. Both. Is there a difference right now? Kidron considered that honestly. Less than there should be. Irakai turned back to the tablet. Picked it up. Set it down again. That place took 11 years from me. Yes. A piece of paper doesn't give those back. I know. Price losing his job doesn't give them back. I know that too. So what exactly is the offer supposed to repair? Kidron was quiet for a moment. He didn't reach for a clean answer, which Irakai noticed. Nothing, Kidron said finally. It doesn't repair anything. It can't. What happened to you happened. The years are gone. The offer isn't repair. Then what is it? A future that matches what you were capable of before someone decided to stop you. That sat in the air between them. Irakai looked at the middle distance, past Kidron, past the door, past the street outside. The look of someone running through something complicated that didn't have a clean end. You know what the worst part was, he said, quiet. It wasn't the accusation. It wasn't the investigation. It wasn't even the dismissal. He set down the inventory scanner. It was that for about 2 weeks after, I kept waiting for someone to come back. To say they'd looked closer. That something hadn't added up. That they wanted to hear my side again. A pause. Nobody came. Kedron held his coffee cup and didn't say anything. Because there was nothing to say that would improve on the truth of that. 2 weeks of a 23-year-old waiting for someone with power and authority to look closely enough to see what was actually there. Nobody came. "I'm not the same person who worked those sessions," Irakai said. "That version of me believed the system worked if you just did everything right. Does the current version want to help fix the system?" Irakai looked at him for a long moment. "I'll consider it," he said. "The careful version. The version that held everything back." Kedron nodded. Picked up his coffee. "On one condition," Irakai added. Kedron stopped. Turned back. Irakai was looking directly at him now. No deflection. No careful distance. Just the full, measured weight of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say and had chosen to say it. "I'll name it when I'm ready. Not before." And somehow that, more than the folder, more than the letter, more than all of the documentation and correction and accountability, was the first moment that Kedron Sorn felt genuinely uncertain about what came next. Not the organization. Him. Personally. Uncertain in a way that didn't feel like a problem to solve. It felt like something else entirely. The condition had 3 parts. Irakai delivered them 2 days later. Not at the store, he asked Kedron to meet him at a coffee shop 3 blocks over. Neutral ground. His choice of location. That detail alone said something. He arrived first. Had already ordered. Was sitting at a corner table with both hands around a mug when Kedron walked in. Kedron ordered at the counter and sat down across from him. No folder. No documents. Nothing between them except 2 mugs and the table. "First," Irakai said, without preamble. "Omega translators and linguistic analysts within the syndicate's diplomatic infrastructure receive the same protection designation as Alpha-tier staff. Formal record of any investigation involving an Omega analyst requires an independent review panel, not internal, not delegated. Separate." Kedron nodded. "Second. Whistleblower protections. Real ones, with enforcement mechanisms and a reporting channel that doesn't run through the same office that's being reported on." Agreed. "Third." Irakai looked at his mug. Then up. "I want the role structured so that I report directly. Not through 3 layers of senior leadership who can slow walk or redirect concerns until they disappear. If I'm going to sit at those tables again, I need to know my voice actually reaches the room where decisions get made." A pause. Not a symbolic position. A real one. Kedron looked at him for a moment. "Those 3 conditions are going to require structural changes to the organization." "Yes," Irakai said. "They are. The board will push back on the independent review panel. They'll call it a process disruption. Probably. And the whistleblower channel will require a compliance infrastructure we don't currently have." "I know." Kedron leaned back. Considered. Irakai watched him and didn't say anything else. He had said what he needed to say. The rest was Kedron's to sit with. "The board pushback," Kedron said finally, "is a timeline problem. Not a no. The infrastructure is buildable, 6 months, maybe 8. He looked at Irakai. "The direct reporting structure is the easiest of the 3. I assumed. Because you know how these organizations work. I translated for them for 4 years. I know exactly how they work." Something almost like a smile moved across Kedron's face. Not broad. Not performed. Just real. Then you'll understand why it's going to take longer to change them than either of us wants. I have patience, Irakai said. 11 years of practice. That landed with a quiet weight that both of them felt. Not bitterness in it, just truth. The kind that had been earned. They sat there for a while after that. Coffee getting warm. Street noise coming through the window. The conversation had said everything it needed to say, and neither of them was in a rush to fill what came after it. Weeks passed. The structural review began. Valeric led the compliance committee. Torvith handled the board conversations, privately, directly, in the way that only Torvith could, where disagreement felt less like an option by the end of the meeting. Irakai kept working the night shift. Not because he had to. The restoration letter had come with a financial settlement that made the convenience store wages irrelevant. He kept working because the transition wasn't final yet, and because 2 years of a life didn't disappear just because something better was coming. You finished what you started. Kedron kept coming in. Tuesday nights, mostly. Sometimes Thursday. Always the same hour. Coffee. Counter. Conversation that started somewhere practical and usually ended somewhere else. Irakai started answering in longer sentences. Not a decision he made consciously. It just happened, the same way the Karzathi had happened that first night, language moving ahead of the mind's instructions. The wall that had served him so well for so long was still there. But it had a door in it now. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week of April, Kedron came in at the usual hour. Poured his coffee. Walked to the counter. They talked about the compliance committee timeline. About a translation case that had come up in a preparatory session, a dialect question Irakai had fielded by email that afternoon. About nothing in particular. Then Kedron set down his cup and reached for his change from an earlier transaction he'd left on the counter. Irakai reached for it at the same moment. Their hands met across the counter. Not a brush this time. A full overlap, his hand over Kedron's, the change beneath both of them, neither of them moving. The store was quiet. The light buzzed. Neither of them pulled away. 1 second. 2. Long enough that it wasn't accidental anymore and both of them knew it. Irakai looked down at their hands. Then up. Kedron was already looking at him. No declaration. No confession. No dramatic pivot towards something larger. Just two people on opposite sides of a counter, both choosing, in the same quiet moment, to stay exactly where they were. Real power isn't the ability to command. It's the courage to change the systems you inherited. And sometimes, the beginning of something real isn't announced. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives in a moment like this one. Where the choice to stay, when leaving would have been easier, says everything that words can't. If this story moved you, if you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel like the truth you carried didn't matter, this one was written for you. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Every story here is built to remind you that quiet strength is still strength. That justice, even when it's late, is still justice. And that the people who hold on, the ones who keep showing up, are the ones the story eventually comes back for. Drop a comment below. Tell us, have you ever stayed quiet about something you knew was wrong because you didn't think anyone would believe you? Your story matters. Share it. You might be the person someone else needed to hear today.